we are really glad to be here today in White City, where there is a growing deep tech industry, a kind of ecosystem, and a growing life sciences cluster. And one contributing factor to this flourishing ecosystem is the area's proximity to Imperial, both as an academic institution and as a healthcare trust. And this proximity enables access to Hammersmith Hospital, the Northwest Clinical Trials Alliance, and Paddington Life Sciences. We all know that proximity can play a significant role, but it is the spirit of partnership and shared purpose that truly underpins our success, including the success of clinical trials. Partnership is woven into the DNA of Upstream, and we wouldn't be here today if not for the collaborative efforts over the past 4 years with Imperial's chemistry and enterprise department, with whom we started the Deep Tech Network, and that kind of evolved into Jawdrop. So as the representative for the Deep Tech Network team today, we are delighted to collaborate with Paddington Life Sciences and Imperial College Healthcare Trust to bring you this evening's fireside. Afternoon. So I hope it's going to be an insightful and enjoyable event. And the order of business is pretty simple. I'm going to introduce June Raine, our keynote speaker. She's going to speak to you, and then we're going to go into the panel discussion. And as part of that, we've got some planned questions, but I think Graham's very keen as our chair to ensure that you as your audience have a say and bring in your own questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce June Raine, who is CEO of the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency. She trained in medicine in Oxford after completing a master's degree in pharmacology. Her interest in drug safety led her to a career in medicines regulation, which has spanned a number of roles in assessment, management and strategic development within the UK National Authority. She was elected in 2012 as the first chair of the European Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee and is also co-chair of the WHO Advisory Committee on the Safety of Medicinal Products. Her special interests are in monitoring the outcomes of regulatory action, risk communication and patient involvement in the regulatory process. June, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Prima. And thank you for your kind words. It really is an enormous pleasure to be here this evening at the Jawdrop Fireside, what potential those words hold. Because really this is a great time to be thinking about unleashing the power of clinical trials. Never a better time, really. And I'd like to thank the organisers and Professor Graham Cooke in particular for inviting me. Graham, as some colleagues will know, is the interim chair of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. So Graham, you know all about unleashing power when it's sitting there and ready to be unleashed. So thank you again. In this really short keynote, what I'd like to do is give you a regulatory perspective. Yes, regulatory perspective on clinical trials now and in the future, because we really are on a journey and we're at a pivotal moment in the evolution of the regulation of clinical trials here in the UK. So let me take you on this short journey. I think we should look at a number of questions because this is all about driving innovation. You get the sense in this incredible location where so much science is going on and so much translation of that science into healthcare. So how are we as a regulator driving innovation? What have we put in place to support clinical trials? And where are we going next to reform our clinical trial regulations? So that's a key aspect of what I'd like to talk about tonight. And of course, as Prima has said, where are you? Partnership is what this is all about, working in partnership. I'd like to say a very brief word about the MHRA. Yes, we're in a very large office block down at Canary Wharf, and this is where the regulatory work is undertaken. Our Commission on Human Medicines, our board meets, with a strong focus on facilitating timely access so that our expertise and resources do not keep patients, the public, the health service waiting. But we also look to unleash regulatory reform, and that's a really key aspect of what I'll talk about. And our basic science, which is undertaken in laboratories at this Greenfield site at South Mims, are a fundamental part of what is a new organisational structure. not least, let's not forget being a partner internationally. This is a World Health Organization centre. After COVID, it seemed pretty obvious that we should all be working in an integrated fashion, and therefore we introduced the concept of an end-to-end regulator, enabling innovation, accelerating access, and strengthening patient safety, but with a very laser-like focus on the patient in all our activities. What drivers are shaping the future of regulation? Having been part of that really robust decision-making network for a quarter of a century. But let's focus more on the life sciences vision, which again puts innovation at its heart. And let's not forget what we learned during COVID about adapting regulation to the science we were dealing with and doing so as rapidly as possible, hence the focus on the 100 days mission. But a more recent report, I think, should be in focus for us all here tonight, and that's the review led by James O'Shaughnessy, looking at how to improve the environment for clinical trials in the UK. And although there are 5 themes and 27 recommendations, I was really entranced last night to look again at James's starting point, which is the fantastic science. This Imperial is one of the 10 leading universities in the world, and James focused on this as he began his review alongside the 3 other universities in that top 10 list. But he said without any hesitation that the regulatory burden needs to be reduced, and we need to focus on speedily getting trials set up. Now, we had a backlog, and here we go to tell you what happened. And some of you who may have experienced this are very much in the thoughts and minds of us as we lost staff post-EU exit, we recruited, but there was a lag and there was an accumulation of clinical trials. With intense work over the summer, and these are the applications week by week, and in the next slide, blue bar application, red bar amendments, we gradually got rid of that backlog. And I want to talk a little bit more about what we learnt during that period. But what you can see is that we approved about 2,000 trials in a space of about 6 to 8 weeks without sacrificing scientific rigour and that interaction with trialists that is so very important. So what did we do to make a difference? And that's, I think, the clue to where we go with trial reform. Yes, we put a lot of resource in, expertise from preclinical, clinical, quality, biostatistics, and we recruited as we could. But we enhanced the communication, the dialogue, and the interaction with trialists. And I believe that's something that really is at the heart of how we should regulate trials for the future, a partnership type arrangement. We worked in a risk proportionate way, but here's the clue. We looked at trials that are multi-centre in nature and looked hard at the approvals given by other regulators around the world. And so when a trial had already been looked at rigorously, we were there to use that assessment. And therefore we were able to track progress and move much more speedily. And last but not least, and there may be colleagues here tonight who were part of that, if you like, network, the bigger network supporting us, the National Institute for Health Research, the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, all came on board with this initiative because of its vital importance. So what did we do? We launched a couple of weeks ago a notification scheme. This is the upshot of working in a more risk proportionate way and with an eye to the past, where some colleagues may remember a clinical trial exemption scheme. Doctors, dentists, qualified health professionals could start a trial and there wouldn't be a lot of bureaucracy to have to deal with. So eligible for notification are the kinds of trials in the list. It is a first step. Phase 3 and Phase 4 trials will be looked at within 14 days. It is simply the beginning of the overhaul of clinical trials regulation. Where did that begin? It began actually with a consultation early in 22, where we looked at how we could streamline regulation, remove obstacles, and actually focus more on bringing innovation through the system. Focusing too on underserved populations, and I hope that will be a strong focus of the panel discussion tonight. particularly thinking about international interoperability. We knew from COVID how important it is for a trial to move from one country to another without having to go through hoops again. All summarised as better regulation for better trials for better health. Here we are with a response published in March. Why so long? Well, if you think back to last September, I think there were one or two events, particularly the changes in central government, that meant that we bounced backwards and forwards with our proposals till we eventually were able, with the Life Sciences Council support, to publish our proposals in March. Patient safety, clearly top of the list. Embedding public involvement, be part of research, etc. Streamlining processes, as I've described, and undertaking our work in a much more risk proportionate way, thinking internationally. There's something missing off that list. And I think it's the focus on the panel of health inequalities. So let's see where this panel discussion takes us and see if we can get it back in there. All in all, with some boosting of our funding from the Chancellor's spring statement, we have enhanced our team, and we're looking now to move forward with a much more strategic approach, building on the one-to-one communications that are so important. And let's not forget real-world data. The data resource we have, called the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, can help speedy recruitment. We want to use every tool in the book to help these trials that we approve get recruitment and to move forward as quickly as possible. So our ability to search from a GP database of 16 million plus patients with willing GPs to talk to research-ready patients or research-eligible patients and invite them, and if they're willing, to actually go and be part of the contact study centres recruitment. So various tools that the regulator wishes to use to unleash that power. And in summary, as we move towards thinking about partnership, the WHO, yes, with the Health Research Authority, with the National Institute of Health Research, we're already working extremely closely. Our stakeholder group has been incredible. I think colleagues in this room might have been part of it to help get liftoff to our notification scheme. But now the focus really needs to be international. And so without any delay, our International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, I'm afraid I have to go to Australia in a week to get this moving, but Canada, Ireland, other countries all ready to start looking at an international regime that really fixes the delays. And in the Oval, we have our close working relationships already with Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland. So a lot of good to come out of international relationships that are there already. They've been strengthened during COVID. Can we use this to our advantage to unleash the power of clinical trials? So what's missing? Here's a test. It's the FDA. So the FDA will be discussing with very soon about how we too can work with them after some initial discussions quite recently. Everyone in this room, I think, is a research partner. Whether you are an active researcher, whether you're in training or working clinically, be part of research, I think, applies to all of us. And so the various activities and interfaces that I hope you will grab and be interacting with us include horizon scanning, early scientific advice, dialogue during assessment. I won't go on, but we need to focus on making our ecosystem the very best for research. So the opportunity, I said, is when it is now. We're going to shape the legal framework for the future because for patients, every day counts. We hear a lot about health and the economy. Industry is eager to move from deployment to discovery, to development, to deployment. And for us in regulation, this chance won't come again. It is a once-in-a-generation chance. So scientifically, I think tonight is about igniting innovation and taking this opportunity. I'd like to say I hope I've convinced you that our focus is to facilitate access. We've got the twin goals of operational efficiency and reform, and that means really taking the chance to do things differently. But overall, it's partnerships that are going to be key to success. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion to light the fuel that will light the fire. Thank you.
So welcome everybody, thank you very much for coming. My name's Graham Cooke, I'm a clinical academic, my background's in infectious disease, and I'm really here, well I do trials, but I'm really here in my role as the research lead for the Faculty of Medicine locally. I'll ask all the panel just to come and sit, because I'm not going to give you a big walk-on. But at first, while you're doing that, I'll just, please come and sit on the couches here. And June, I think there's a space for you if you'd like to come in. While we're doing that, I just thank Prema and all the team at Jawdrop who have put this together, had to reorganise it due to a strike. And we did lose some of our original panel, but we now have a fantastic new panel. And of course, Dame June was able to come as well, which is fantastic. So thank you very much for that. It would be helpful for me just to know a little bit about who's in the audience. We don't have an online audience. So could you just put your hand up if you're a university employee? Sort of minority, and in a sort of local company, or not many, a few. If you're on the White City campus, if you're in clinical trials, okay, quite a lot. If you've been a participant in a clinical trial, oh, not enough. All right, great. Well, look, I really want to get some questions as we go, but we'll start off just with introduced. I'll let the panel introduce themselves as we go around, and just if you could just give a brief sort of background as to how you get here, but also what clinical trials mean to you, either you or your organisation. And June used it once. You're not allowed to use the C word yet. We'll come to COVID later.
Okay. Well, it's a C word as well because we work in cancer, right?
Okay.
So I don't know. This is on. Yeah. So I'm Nahuel Villegas. I'm the CSO of Vivan Therapeutics. It's a small startup. It's a biotech that is early stage yet, and we live here across the street in the Westward building. What we do is to develop very personalized treatment for people with cancer. And these treatments are very tailored to each individual. So what we do is for every patient, we identify this treatment. That is my work only for that patient, not for the other ones, right? And right now we have patients coming to us from all over the world, but they're very scattered, right? One patient here, one patient there. And we are gathering data, but it's a kind of isolated data, right, on clinical outcomes. And what we need to do now, if we want to prove that our therapies, the therapies coming from our technology, are actually better than standard of care, better or not than standard of care, we need to be more engaged in clinical studies and in clinical trials. That's why this is matter a lot for us.
And I think you said earlier that you're relatively new to clinical trials, and I think others are more embedded. So perhaps if the others could also just sort of give an example of what they've seen as the greatest change in clinical trials in their experience as well, that would be quite interesting. Rob.
Hi, Rob Hastings. I'm Medical Affairs Director at... Is that still on? Or have we gone off completely? Good. I'm Medical Affairs Director at Novartis in the UK. So Novartis is a global pharmaceutical company, so Swiss based, but we have our UK office in White City, so moved in before the C word that I'm not allowed to mention, so across the way. And one of the key drivers for that was to embed in the kind of local life science and health system and be part of the community. So my role has kind of one of its functions is around how do we get the UK working for clinical trials, as well as how do we ensure that we link parts of the UK into our global research and development organisation. So I guess clinical trials in my time, I kind of argue that I haven't seen huge changes in clinical trials per se. So obviously I thankfully post-date all the kind of big work on harmonisation and kind of fundamentals of trial delivery. I think what I have seen over the last years is that in pockets, things have really moved on in terms of trial design, in terms of kind of innovation, whether that's use of data or technology. I think we don't have that widespread yet, and there's a number of reasons for that we can touch on. And I think there is a huge opportunity in the UK if we can kind of get the system working and get these kind of incremental benefits embedded in the right place in the research system, then we can kind of move from being what is always regarded as a science power to being a true kind of operational delivery power, which I think I am often having to justify to our global organisation.
Hi everyone, my name's Suki Balendra. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the audience from Northwest London and beyond today. So my role is a couple of hats. So I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships for Paddington Life Sciences, and a great pleasure to be hosting this event jointly today. I also lead the North West London Clinical Trials Alliance, which we will talk about across the panel session this afternoon, and also wear a hat for the MHRA Clinical Research Network. And I've spent the last 15 years in North West London working on clinical trials. I'm passionate in my belief that the UK is the best place to conduct clinical trials, and spend a lot of time attracting more commercial clinical trials into North West London. I think the biggest changes I've seen is one around sample sizes. So 15 years ago when I started in clinical trials, you'd often see sites with a target of 15 or 20. Now you're seeing sites with a target of 3 to 5. And so it's much more complex for these sites to deliver the studies, because the margin between not recruiting anyone and recruiting your full sample size is really tight. And that's difficult for our sites to tackle. We've also seen a real spread of the clinical trials coming to the UK. So historically, we would have seen the top 10 sponsors like Novartis giving us the majority of the clinical trials into the UK. Now we're seeing much smaller companies bringing clinical trials into the UK and actually making up a much larger proportion of our clinical trials. And I have to say, the third thing, which I talk about a lot nowadays, is diversity and equity in clinical trials. It's the most important agenda item for the life sciences industry at the moment. It's the number one topic of discussion they want to talk to us about. How are we involving our community in our clinical trials?
So Angela.
I'm Angela McFarlane. I am Vice President for Northern Europe for IQVIA, the almost unpronounceable name. Some people say IQVIA, but it's IQVIA. So we're a commercial clinical research organisation, and if you're not familiar with that business model, we actually conduct clinical trials on behalf of our pharmaceutical and biotech sponsors. It's a hugely competitive environment. And when we bid for a study and are appointed as their CRO of choice, we then have to make the case for which country we're going to go to. Our sponsors will usually have their own ideas. And since 2017, I have been on a mission to really make the case for the UK, building on Suki's words, to be the go-to destination for commercial clinical trials. It's been a tough battle. But one of the things that is absolutely in our lifeblood at IQVIA is human data science. And one of the reasons the UK is such a fantastic place to do clinical trials is because of our cradle-to-grave longitudinal record, and optimizing that into our research so that we can get first patients in much quicker is just a unique differentiator for the UK compared with the rest of the world. I think the other piece that we have to really remember is, and this is something I'm particularly passionate about and will mention quite a few times tonight, patients who are in clinical research, the evidence shows that they have better outcomes than those that are not. And it stands to logic. And then the other piece, which is about the wealth of the UK, is that as a commercial organisation, every year we attract 1.2 billion of economic impact into UK PLC by the commercial clinical trials that we make the case for the UK being the place to conduct them. So that's that one. And then on the paradigm shift, on the question of change, I think for me, I knew Suki would say diversity, so I thought I'd better come in with something else and not steal her thunder. And we are going to talk about that more. But I think the hyperacceleration of vaccines and treatment discoveries and that kind of co-creation, and I know I can't use the C word, but that's created the paradigm shift in respect of how the world prepares for disease Y or the next pandemic, and June alluded to that with the 100 Days Mission. And I think, you know, the fantastic work of the 100 Days Mission, industry, and the CEPI programme, that's going to bring a geo-change. And the thing that excites me most about that is what we didn't achieve in COVID, which was getting these studies run in low middle-income countries and having equity between the Northern Hemisphere and low middle-income countries. And that is an absolute mission of the mission.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to sort of orientate people, I think, as was mentioned earlier, this is the first partnership meeting between Upstream, which is, I'm going to get this right, it's the partnership with Imperial and Hammersmith and Fulham, and then Paddington Life Sciences. And so Novartis and IQVIA represent that well in their locations, respectively, in White City and Paddington. And of course, one of the strengths of this campus in particular is the co-location, not just of the science, but also the enterprise and the business, and the proximity to public health. For those of you who've seen the building going up outside, that's the new School of Public Health, which, believe it or not, will be open in a week, but I'm not sure if I believe that. And then, of course, proximity to the hospital, and that's by way of introduction to Martin, who is based primarily at the Phase 1 unit at Hammersmith.
Yes, I'm Martin Wilkins. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and I forgive you if you don't know what that discipline is. We're a dying breed. We're down to our last few breeding pairs. And I'm based at the Hammersmith Hospital. My wife would say I live at the Hammersmith Hospital, where I look after the MHRA Clinical Research Facility, which is focusing on early phase clinical studies, so deep phenotyping through to early studies in man, early phase studies in man. And in terms of sort of paradigm shift, June mentioned the doctor's exemption certificate. I'm old enough to remember the doctor's exemption certificate. I was cleaning up my hard disk the other day and I found the form that you have to complete in order to qualify. And June also mentioned in private earlier the yellow card system, which is now in the Science Museum. I think the doctor's exemption certificate is another thing that could go into the Science Museum. So we've moved away from that to a more, dare I say, a formal way of applying for permission to do clinical studies in humans, which has brought with it a lot more paperwork and need to satisfy different bodies. I think on the whole that's a good thing, but of course it is something which one has to qualify against the extra administrative burden of clinical research. But I think what is being in the early clinical trials space, what I think I've seen more, a more positive comment, I guess, would be that it's more of an academic discipline now. It's more, I think when I was training in clinical pharmacology, the sort of clinical research I did was often commercially driven. Now I think I see a lot more studies, opportunities coming through from the academic side, and also a lot of opportunities for evaluating drugs at an early stage of their first use in man, through, for example, advanced imaging technology. So a better opportunity to understand the mechanism of action of drugs, to provide perhaps a stronger argument for advancing them into clinical trials. Or, and I think this is equally important, perhaps a lesson that industry follow, but perhaps academia are less willing to follow, is to fail early so that you filter out your molecules that you're taking into human studies and don't expose humans to molecules that aren't going to work. Every human experiment, I think, is very precious, and you're beholden to learn as much as you can from that exposure. And we can talk about sort of building into the design of the experiment, what happens if the drug fails to show an efficacy signal? What can we learn from that exposure that might add to our education and be used to inform other drug development? So maybe I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And I think we'll probably come back to that question about what the right level of regulation is perhaps later on. We might not come back to ask you why you were cleaning your hard drives. So we'll see that. Thank you, and that's a really helpful introduction. And I think you can see we've got a really broad sort of range of interests and expertise here, which reflects the breadth of what goes on in clinical trials. So I said you couldn't use the C word. I think we can't really talk about trials without talking about COVID. And I think we can all sort of think of great success stories. You know, a lot of us have spent a lot of time trying to say how brilliant things were. I'd just like to ask you each what you think the lessons that we haven't quite learned are at this point. You know, what did happen well, but we haven't really embedded in what we're doing in the future. And I think maybe I'll go to you first, Angela, because you kind of touched on this in relation to low middle income trials. I don't know whether that's what you feel is the most important one.
So, in terms of lessons of COVID, I mean, look, it was that one mission approach, and normal operating behaviour was just dropped for the mission, and the MHRA couldn't keep working 24/7 to approve all the studies that were coming through, and nor could everybody else that was behind that one mission approach. However, I do think we've missed a few tricks. First patient in a study for a country is a really important key metric in this competitive environment in which we operate. And during COVID, the UK, and we conducted the majority of COVID vaccine studies, the UK was first patient in time and time and time again. And then we kind of went back a little bit to business as usual. Now, one of the areas, and June and her team have done some fantastic work about accelerating, and she's also been very candid with the challenges that have been faced. But going around to 87 different local ethics committees in trusts, after the MHRA has already said yes, just seems like an interminable waste of time. And remember, an awful lot of these ethics committees, they don't sit regularly. And they're not necessarily experts sitting on them either, which is even more frustrating. So I think that really needs to change. I think one of the... Yeah, please.
Pick that up. So would you be pushing for more centralisation in some of these processes?
Yeah. I mean, if the MHRA says it's a good thing to do, it's a bit like with NICE, when local drug and therapeutic committees, when the NICE review comes out, start reviewing it all over again. Either you have a national body that makes a decision on cost effectiveness in that case, and we all believe it, or you don't. Either we have an MHRA that regulates and makes great decisions about the trial's safety and all the rest of the outcomes, or we don't. Why do we need to waste everybody else's time at local level doing it? So yeah, I am for decentralisation on that, because that will really help getting first patient in. Half the time, these ethics committees don't even sit in the summer. That's a problem. So the other thing that I would really like to think about, us to think about, is I've mentioned two things before, but I'm going to say it again. I would like every director of finance in every integrated care system not only made to read the O'Shaughnessy report and the implementations, but to take accountability for holding his team to account or her team to account about what commercial clinical research is being done in their hospital. Because I tell you what, it would go an awful long way to helping the deficit situation that every bar one ICS is in at the moment. So getting that director of finance, this is part of your health and wealth. So that's the other thing. And then embedding research in routine care. So when you see your GP or when you see your consultant, not only are you saying, what treatment, what care, well, they won't say care pathway, but what drug am I going to get? Our clinicians should be saying, let's have a look at what trials are available for you. And IQVIA, through the trials it brings in, we bring about 19 million savings on the drug budget every single year. So all sorts of benefits to be embedded.
Yeah, and I think the financial thing's obviously important, but I think you mentioned earlier that there is evidence that if you're in trials, your outcomes are better. And I guess the bit we haven't captured is the fact that you can get earlier access to things, be those devices or treatments, if the trials are actually running.
Yeah,
which is a big issue, isn't it? Does anyone want to pick up on other aspects of things that you think we haven't quite learnt well enough from COVID?
Yes. One of the things for me is undoubtedly COVID brought research into the public domain. And I think, again, in pockets, I think we've probably moved forward on some of that sort of patient, public, community engagement, but it's very much pockets. I don't think we have fully capitalised on what that could have looked like or taking advantage of that. And I guess that links into Angela's point of then, it being embedded in routine care. I think, the big negative of COVID is that it's put the system under huge strain, and we're in a, maybe not unique, but I think we're at an extreme point when you compare us to other countries, in that a lot of our research is very intimately embedded in clinical care, and that has a lot of potential advantage, but it also has the disadvantage of when that's under strain, it's easy to see it as an additional burden. And I think, that narrative that Angela has kind of made a number of points on already, but, it needs to be part of the solution in that kind of community health system, rather than another thing that we're doing that is just taking resource away.
Yeah, and do you have any thoughts about how we do that? I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, is it?
No, I think, like I say, I think public community engagement predominantly does need to be local. Like I say, I don't think we've moved on that conversation enough. And particularly, again, one of the key elements of COVID was around how data was used. And that is a tricky conversation, but one that in pockets is being had really well of, what is acceptable use of data? What do people want to know? What do we need to kind of actually do in terms of supporting communities and patients in what they want addressing? So I think we need to kind of systematize some of that, where things have gone well. I look at, again, locally, I know just more around data than trials, but Discover Now have done great work in their engagement and the kind of One London piece, a London level on data, but I don't see that happening elsewhere. And I think the same is true of research. How do we make sure that we are having that engagement in each system and linking it into the ICBs and their missions, as well as making research a priority? How are they engaging to understand what are their community needs? What are we going to prioritise in research?
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. No, well, maybe I'll come to you. I mean, I know that it may not be directly relevant to your kind of work, but the sort of community engagement, we are in one of the most diverse populations of the country, and I think we'll talk more about diversity, but I guess for the personalised medicine agenda, then engaging with the community is probably important, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very important. Actually, linked to the COVID situation. So this is linked to the COVID discussion and about diversity as well, and genetic diversity. Something that I guess one lesson we can take from COVID situation, and something that COVID exposed very well, is that the same disease or the same cause of a disease, in this case a virus, can have very different consequences in different people. And this is because everybody is different. And you have two persons, each one of them getting the same coronavirus strain. One of them is totally asymptomatic, and the other one passed away a couple of weeks later. And it's exactly the same disease, exactly the same virus. So you need to consider the full context of that person. And for the personalization, this is quite relevant, right? It's very important. What this is telling us is that we cannot treat all the people with the same therapy. Either it's COVID, it's Alzheimer, it's cancer, it's whatever disease. In cancer, this is the same. Two people with the same type of cancer are being treated with the same therapies. And it might work for one of them, it might not work for the other one. And this is, I guess, what is pointing out is that individualization or personalization of the medicines, either in COVID, cancer, or whatever disease, is really the direction, the way we need to go.
Martin, can I bring you in? I mean, any things that you can see that we should be doing better?
I guess two things. One sort of national, one more local. On the national level, I think what I appreciated most was we became less risk averse, I think, in decision making during COVID. I think things happened more quickly, and I think that is the right thing to do. And the idea of broadening the network to assess clinical trial applications I think it was inspirational. I think, it obviously reduced your backlog. I think it also perhaps engaged a community that could bring perhaps a sense of risk. If you, I believe in the sort of community approach to decision making, where the more people you engage in decision making, the more likely you are to get the right answer. And I think that is something which would be good to continue if there was an opportunity to do so. On a local level, Graham, I miss our evening chats. We used to meet once a week online, where all the projects that were coming through the trust were discussed, prioritised, and given appropriate weighting and backing. Maybe there is still some room for that in a. I know it's 5 o'clock till whenever 6:30, but with a glass of wine, I mean you can get a lot done.
The risk tolerance goes very differently. Doesn't it?
So I think on a local level there was an opportunity to do that. So again, it's all about community engagement.
Yeah, I mean, but there is an important point there about people's capacity for work, which I think we can easily forget, not individually, but as a community we can forget how hard people were working and how that is just not sustainable.
Sure.
And it does worry me sometimes that we sort of transplant what happened easily to now, and it's much harder to make it happen.
Yeah.
Sorry, Suki, I haven't missed you out. I wanted to make a bridge, so I'll come to you and just your thoughts on other aspects of COVID and what more can we do to learn those lessons properly?
Northwest London, when the pandemic hit, we really took the bull by the horns and, thought that we could really deliver these COVID vaccine trials in a way that, we've never seen before. And we did that by the collaboration across the region. So, a lot of the people in the room today were part of the collaboration that we set up, which then became the Northwest London Clinical Trials Alliance. But it was this collaboration between the clinical research facilities, so Martin's at Hammersmith, Northwick Park Hospital, and Marta Bafito with Chelsea and Westminster. We brought that collaboration together along with all of primary care and then the NIHR Clinical Research Network, to really form that structure to deliver the COVID trials. And, to Martin's point about those calls, we were speaking together both at a clinical level and at an operational level to deliver all of those studies in a really efficient way. And, in Northwest London, we thought we can't lose this good work just because the COVID vaccine trials were going to come to an end in their current form. And, that's where we sort of set up the Northwest London Clinical Trials Alliance, which is this collaboration now between all the trusts in the Northwest London integrated care system, working together regionally. We meet life science companies on a regional basis, and we work very collaboratively on projects like diversity and inclusion with the pharma industry. So it's been a real positive kind of news story from COVID. And, I was at the New Statesman conference this morning, and a lot of, the sort of politicians and the companies were talking about wanting to see that model of the vaccine task force where you had that collaboration between industry, academia, the NHS working together. And that's what we are trying to do in Northwest London, to continue that collaboration in order to deliver the clinical trials.
Yeah, I guess, of course, a key part of the legacy is the pipeline of vaccine trials that we still have coming through, and the strategic focus on that. You touched on diversity, and I think a couple of other people have done that already, but I think it's such an important issue that really had a spotlight during an early phase of COVID, at least. It's probably disappeared slightly, but I mean, it's obviously an area of personal interest of yours. So why do you think that's such an important thing for what's going on, not just locally, but nationally? And what more can we do to try and ensure a more inclusive set of trials that we're running?
So actually, although I've just spoken about the successes of the COVID vaccine trials, what we didn't actually do as well was represent our population in those trials. So actually, when you look at the COVID vaccine trials that we delivered, they were not as diverse as they could have been for multiple reasons. You know, we were quite reliant on the National Vaccine Registry for our recruitment, and that skewed our recruitment slightly. And there was such a focus on the target and getting the target as quickly as possible. And, you know, kind of diversity in some trials went out the window. And that's why it became my sort of personal mission to do something about it, to not allow ourselves to be in that situation again where diversity was not high on the agenda for all those trials. And we published a report earlier this year between Imperial, and Shuli's here from the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, and Neelam Patel from MedCity at the time. And we published these recommendations to the sector about thinking about what you need to do in terms of diversity and equity in clinical trials, and really take a whole systems approach. And one aspect of that is the community, as we've just spoken about. You can't deliver clinical trials without the trust within your community. And there has been mistrust, and COVID only exacerbated those perceptions. So there is a job for us to do, which is not a short-term piece of work, to gain that trust within our communities and really raise the profile of health and research. And as Rob said, you know, we had that profile raised during COVID, and we have to continue to sustain that profile. There is a responsibility for the sponsors, you know, to think about their protocols, you know, the exclusion criteria in their protocols, excluding certain populations. Is there, for example, their commercial function and clinical trial functions really speaking together about the agenda of diversity? Because when we talk to pharmaceutical companies, the arm of that company is really engaged on diversity. But perhaps that is not spread through the whole organisation. And that is true of the NHS as well. And we made recommendations around the leadership. You know, the key opinion leaders. Are your pool of key opinion leaders as diverse as they could be? You know, thinking about those aspects when you're setting up your trial, delivering your trial. You know, I can go on, but it is so important that we think about diversity really early on, and it's a sustained effort between all of us in the research community.
Yeah, and we don't have anyone to talk to the NHS component, but I can tell you from my own experience, one of the biggest challenges was trying to get data, because we think we capture data on ethnicity as people come in hospital, but we don't do it very well. No. And so many bits of this need to be done better for things to work. In a minute, I'm going to ask June to come and sort of respond to some of these things, but I think you touched on the role of the sponsors and why it matters to have diverse trials. So I don't know, do you want to comment on that from a sponsor perspective, Rob?
Yeah, happy to. So I guess as a company, we've since COVID really, and even before, we've focused a lot on health inequalities in the UK as a UK organisation. I think it's fair to say, so trials diversity is a part of that. I think it's fair to say in the UK, COVID has actually been a hindrance to this, in that, you know, it's been a bit of a matter of just getting anyone into a trial, in all honesty. And it's now very much back on the agenda. So we've done a lot of work as a global organisation, particularly in the US, and we're looking at how do we leverage some of that and kind of take some of the learning. So one of the good examples is around, investigators. So, you know, there's a program in the US called Beacon of Hope, which is a collaborative effort. So Novartis, along with Merck, so MSD, and Sanofi, working particularly in what were historically black medical schools in the US. So we don't have that model in the UK, but equally, I think the same is true, that, you know, we need to make sure that investigators are you know, reflective of you know, who we want in our community to be engaged in research as well. And I think I'm acutely aware, again, I know we've kind of glibly mixed or talked to collaboration, talked to partnership. I think the structures like happening in Northwest London are critical. It's very easy to just say, well, we need to collaborate better, but actually setting up the structures where that meaningfully happens are really tricky. And I don't think it's perfect now, but it's better locally here than I see a lot around the UK. Because I'm fully accepting that as a sponsor, as a pharmaceutical company, we are not hugely trusted often. We're not hugely trusted in a lot of the communities where we want to work. And really, as an individual company, we're never going to engage in all of those communities. So we need to work collaboratively in those systems to show, kind of bring what we can do into those environments. But, it does need to be a group effort and kind of understand what the community needs are. And I think one of the things that we often suffer from industry is it needs to be that long-term approach that, none of these things are going to be quick fixes. COVID has highlighted the inequity agenda, but as mentioned, has in some ways deepened in some communities some of that distrust. So how do we build back a better system following COVID than we had before?
Yeah, I was really pleased to see that within the Paddington Life Science collaboration between the Trust, the University and the businesses, that this has been a major plank of that. I think you're quite involved in that, Andrew. Do you have thoughts on this from your perspective?
I echo everything that Suki said, and I think that the Paddington Life Sciences community is a fantastic example of the collaboration that we saw in COVID, but now it's keeping on going. And diversity has been a core work theme of ours. We had a big health inequality summit, diversity, a core work theme of the Paddington Life Science community. We, IQVIA, had a big health inequality summit in May, and we were very privileged to have Professor Bola Owolabi, who is leading NHS England's health inequalities programme, as one of our keynotes. And what we did in the afternoon is we kind of had a hackathon where we asked ICS systems to come with problems that they actually hadn't managed to overcome around health inequalities. And in the morning, we all talked about the great things that we were all doing. And it was like being in an echo chamber, really. But in the afternoon, 3 ICSs volunteered challenges that they had not managed to overcome with health inequalities. So, for example, engaging traveller communities. So that was one piece. But for me, and everybody said it, COVID laid bare the health inequalities that are endemic in our UK system. But I think there's a real opportunity, and Niall, you called it out on personalised medicines. We can't develop medicines unless we take account of diverse populations. And I'm long enough in life sciences and also was surrounded with pharmacologists then, like Martin Kendall, for example, to remember a classic example where we introduced ACE inhibitors for hypertension and heart failure in the 1980s with a great kind of, banner of praise. And Dr. Gareth Beavers and Martin Kendall, who at that point were working in the West Midlands, and that was my kind of region back in the day, were very quick to point out to me that in the real world, the ACE inhibitors did not work properly in black communities. And the calcium channel blockers actually were much better. But that had never come out in the trials. And guess why? Because the trials were not done in those communities. So I think it's a really lovely example of why it matters. And if we're to move towards personalised medicine, and I really like the way you describe the different responses to different viruses in different communities, we have to have that diversity in there. A couple of final points just about kind of what we're doing about it. We've been working on this, and my global lead is here today. We've been working on this since 2016, and certainly when the FDA started to call out we needed to see much better diversity included, and then Europe and the MHRA also followed. But things like, and I'll point out 6 things. So first of all, characterise and validate the intended patient population, the intended diverse population. So that's where you really need to use your real world. Secondly, review the impact of country site mix on race, ethnicity, and we're lucky in the UK, which is another reason we've got the whole of the world living on the UK. You know, there are other countries that are more diverse, but not many. Communication, and again, this was touched on with regard to diversity champions, not just supporting underserved communities, but diversity champions as key opinion leaders, to Suki's point, but also checking the diversity education of the site where you're going to place that trial. Community engagement is massive, and North West London have done some fantastic work around that and creating research ambassadors. And then finally, things like limiting the attrition rate with predictive engagement as part of that whole programme. And all of it underpinned by a diversity platform.
Thank you. I feel like we're just warming up, but I want to try and get questions from the audience in a moment. So if the roving mics are sort of ready to move. But before that, perhaps, June, I mean, so much you could pick from there in that discussion, and then maybe I'll just let you sort of pick out one or two things you think you might want to comment on. But maybe this question about what a regulator should say about diversity is quite an interesting one.
Yes. It's a pity I can't. We'll do some hopscotch.
Can we pass the mic down?
Actually, we can do it. The panel has been stellar. I really want to thank colleagues for the real insights shared. Right. And really, before we come back to the regulator, this is about everyone here who all has a stake in a successful future. I'd like to say that the vaccine task force model, I think, is going to work really well. And for things like the cancer vaccines, we've seen brilliant alliances with the scientists, government, regulator and the NHS that has really increased recruitment into trials, and we must build back that model into everything. I think risk relevance, risk-related resource is key to a lot of this. And first in human, yes, Martin, you'll be in sight. We're not going to let you out of our sights. But for much of the rest, we really can develop a new model that puts the expertise where it needs to be. I think we've really got on the edges of our seats when we've talked about inequality, and you noticed that it was in our first consultation, not in the government response. We've seen what the US FDA has done, and I think we need to look at this again. You can argue that guidelines and flexibilities and so forth are much easier to work with, but in my world, sometimes you need to take a step that's quite definitive. So Suki, we'll talk more about this. And then the outsourcing, the building of our network. I'm so pleased to hear Martin welcome this, because that's what keeps everybody vibrant, up to date, involved with the latest science and so forth. So I think today's a great example of put the minds together and look at what we can do.
So we've got a couple of hands. There's one there, and then one here, and then we'll go up here. So back. Yeah, I've sent you to the furthest point first. I'm sorry, that's my fault. Do you want to start because you're close to a mic?
Sure. Hello, hi. First, a quick question for June. It was great to hear about addressing the backlog in medicines. What about in medical devices, where I understand the backlog is quite bad?
I think we've got a slightly different understanding. I think it isn't, but I'm very happy to talk to you separately about what that difference of opinion might mean. The flow in medicines is many, many times higher. Commensurately, we've got a bigger team. But if there's any delay in something that you're aware of, let's talk about it.
One quick question for Angela about the COVID infection survey. How many people were surveyed in that?
Thank you for giving us that. So the COVID infection survey, which we collaborated with Oxford University and the Office for National Statistics, we had, in the end, just trying to think, so we did 9 million bloods and swabs during the period, undertaken by 4,000 people working for IQVIA on the doorsteps. And we had, forgive me, I've got a bit of brain fog going on. I've got shingles at the moment, and I know those numbers because I'm talking about them all the time. Forgive me, I can't remember the number. I do know, and we've got liquid gold, we have 300,000 people in that survey. That's it, so it was 600,000 individuals. 300,000 people who consented to take part in future government research. And June will know, and I've been on a mission ever since to say, do you realise what gold is sitting there with 300,000 people consented to take part in future government research? And I'm hoping that that's going to be really useful for the dementia mission, because with the dementia mission, they're talking about undertaking a programme of over 55s at risk of dementia screening at home. And I'm so excited about that one. And what a great cohort to start going with. And the Vaccines Task Force Registry, of course, 500,000 people in that Kate Bingham talks about, research ready.
But, obviously in COVID, we all collaborated and no one was competitive at all. Post-COVID, I think we're allowed to be a little bit more competitive. I wasn't familiar with that organisation you mentioned there, but there was another survey, which was the largest one, called REACT, and that has a 2.4 million database of people with contact. So,
forgive me.
Yeah, between the three, there should be a much more use made of those. I think it's
phenomenal, and I do want to come back to you on that because of the dementia mission.
Yeah.
So good little dig there.
We need to get those three together into the conversation. Over there, I think, for the.
Hi. For the context of my question, I introduce myself quickly. I'm Robin, and I'm the CEO of TrilloDocs, an AI tool helping medical writers to reduce the time for the first CSR.
Is that sugar dogs or what?
TrilloDocs, like from trilogy. It's one word,
okay.
Trilogy writing and consulting. Specialized in CSRs, clinical study reports, founded TrilloDocs. We have a rule-based AI which helps a medical writer to draft the first CSR, like based on TFLs, SRPs, CSPs.
You might have to spell those out for some of us. So,
okay, clinical study protocols and the lists and tables of all the clinical trial data. Our AI tool pulls that together and formats it correctly within minutes, whereas usually a medical writer in a full team needs weeks for that. So, and I wonder, as the topic today is innovation, and I learned a lot about diversity, thanks for that, in the course of clinical trials, how you believe, to all the panelists, AI could help to get rid of some of the administrative tasks or help to identify the right mix of diversity patients in a trial, if I may ask. So is it something you think about, or is it like the ghost in terms of Halloween? You don't want to get out of the bottle, the genie.
So anyone can pick this up, but I'm guessing it might be Rob. I mean, I'm thinking about your medical affairs budget, Rob, and then how much you can save.
Is that? Yeah, hi. I think it's a great point. You almost, slightly pointed the question in that I agree with you that I think in the short term, a lot of the benefit is around the administrative tasks. And we are trialing in kind of a number of settings in our regulatory team and elsewhere. How do we use those tools to more efficiently generate materials? A lot of them are relatively standardized, which means that you can relatively easily apply a lot of those tools. And I think in terms of some of the wider areas, again, I think connecting it to the diversity agenda, I think if we don't currently use data well at a very basic level. We don't do data, analytics and data science well in that setting. But I think within that, if we can get the basics right, there are opportunities for AI to understand, a lot of the communities, the missed patients. Where is the risk? I'm looking at Shirley here. Where are the people who are most in need, and are we engaging them in research in the right way? I think some elements of that will be benefited by AI. A lot of it is purely just good data science and some interrogation. But I think there is huge opportunity. It is just making sure that we do it in a structured way. And a lot of our challenges are actually almost internal in a global organization. How do we connect up with everything that's going on internally on some of those questions, as well as then leveraging the best of what's going on outside?
You want to come in?
You mentioned something.
Suki first, and then
I was just going to comment that So we do know, some of the data, for example, the burden of disease that we have in Northwest London, for example. So we know where to place studies, but completely take your point that technology could be used even better to place trials in the right place. And I think, we're seeing AI being used across the whole drug development process, and clinical trials is no exception to that. And I think we haven't actually talked today about decentralized trials, but, actually the move towards preventing the patients having to come into sites for every single visit and using technology like wearables, for example, to collect data in the person's home is, a reality. It's what we're seeing now. We don't have as many decentralized trials, that we see in the US that we have in the UK, but it is coming. We are seeing companies bringing these mixed approaches, these hybrid approaches to decentralized trials. And it's one thing actually that I think in Northwest London we could be at the forefront of, really showcasing our ability to deliver decentralized trials. And we've been working with, some of the companies in the room to look at our models of how we deliver decentralized trials, because a company can't bring to the NHS a decentralized trial without having that discussion beforehand about, how are you going to get the approvals in place? Do you have home nursing? Have you thought about all those things? Where's the data going to be stored? So I think it's really key to have those sort of conversations very early on so that we are able to deliver these truly innovative trials.
And now, well, I think you wanted to come in, I guess, about the discovery side. Or,
just a quick comment about how we can use AI in diversity. That diversity for me is quite tantalizing concept, to be honest, and actually it's a very broad concept that cannot really encapsulate it. And probably we have different ideas about diversity. We are thinking about different things. So in our case, for instance, a minority is an underrepresented molecular signature in a specific tumor type, right? So we know that colorectal cancer, there are 500 of different signatures in there. Some of them are more representative of the population. You have a lot of people in there. Some others are unique. So those are minorities for us, and this is what we want to include. But then there are other layers in there. You have a subpopulation of people and that look similar. Imagine you have exactly the same background and the group genetic signature and taking the same treatment, but some of them might enjoy a drink of wine in the dinner, right? Some of them are going to do exercises, some of them are going to sleep better than others, and everything influences the treatment, right? And there's no way possible we can do it that ourselves. So AI can consider all these little things and give us a better response.
I think there was someone looking keen to come in there. I don't know, was it on AI? No, not now. Okay. So, yeah, go on. Is this on AI? Well, yeah. Okay. Please pass. Do you want to pass the mic?
Hi, Shakib Niazi, Innovate UK Edge. So we're investing another £100 million in Bridge AI, around AI. My specialty is 40 years in tech, 3 fellowships, so I like the scientific stuff. I've got a company that's got a number of thousands of records of Indian EMRs with 30 blood markers. And the reason I'm helping them is because that kind of data isn't easily collectible in the UK to bring in the diversity piece. I've got people looking at projecting out different types of diseases. So the reason I'm here is to find out what's happening in clinical trials. It's an area that I don't know. I'm a techie. But also I've got blood cell counts using optical laser to do the home testing before you go in to do your chemotherapy. So how do we test at home? So those things are being planned and paid for at the research stage with the Innovate UK. What we don't have is that kind of a deep engagement with trusts and organizations doing clinical trials, clinical research, and then bringing it to the commercial side, because that's where I work on the commercialization. So I can see how impactful it will be to the UK economy, how we can drive this forward, but I don't see the joined up dots.
Right. Well, look, maybe we can follow up afterwards. I think that we have structures to try and help people who are coming into the ecosystem. And I think examples like the Biomedical Research Centre, for example, and I can try and point you to some useful people if that's helpful.
That would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Any other points from the panel on AI or in the audience on this particular? Otherwise, we'll take some more questions. I mean, we've got a big AI summit that's about to launch. I don't know if anyone's going. I'm not. I quite fancy going to Bletchley there. Got a question at the back there. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I couldn't see you behind the camera.
Sorry, hello. Hi, I'm Richard Wong. I'm at the MHRA. I was interested to hear the panel's opinion about engaging more with demographics and diversity, and just touching upon what Angela said about getting more global first or having that speed of delivery of clinical trials in the UK. So how do you balance the two opposing forces of speed and cost versus trying to recruit more diversity, because naturally it's going to be a little bit slower or more expensive? So yeah, it would be interesting to hear what's your view, and would you be prepared to have a slower recruitment speed?
How does that tension balance out in a commercial setting, Angela? Can you comment on that?
I think the first thing I'd like to say is don't necessarily assume that it will be slower and more difficult. We talked about trust. A couple of people have mentioned that point. I think as we move towards research being embedded in routine care, that conversation should really help. And I come back to the AI piece again about, validating the populations that are going to go into the study, using AI for the pre-screening. You can cut out an awful lot of time from getting things going by using AI and predictive algorithms in the pre-screening phase. I'm not saying that it's easy to build that trust in communities and it's going to be quick, but I think there are quite a few enablers in the system already.
Yeah, I suppose another example, I was in a conversation the other day about sickle cell disease, and I mean, I hadn't quite appreciated dramatic advances that have been in therapy for sickle cell disease. There's still quite a dynamic pipeline there, and that, I mean, in a sense, that's not a diverse population, that's a specific population where you need to be able to get access quickly. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a trade-off, I guess, between having a range of different ethnic groups in a particular trial and getting first in human.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, sickle cell, the unmet need there, and I think your community has one of the biggest sickle cell populations in the country, but we're about to have our first ever gene therapy.
Yeah.
And it is beyond exciting. I've worked in sickle cell for nearly 20 years. And the debate then, I mean, honestly, I chaired advisory boards where, and Novartis were front and centre of it at the time. So to deal with the iron overload, you have to go through chelation, which means for young people with sickle, you're having a pump stuck to your tummy 5 nights out of 7 for 12 hours, which is fine when you're a child. I mean, it's not fine. But when you hit teenage, your teenage black boy, black girl, Asian boy, Asian girl, they don't want to be at home stuck to this thing. And when Novartis brought in it in a liquid form, I actually had payers saying to me, show me the evidence, show me the patient evidence that they would prefer a drink to a pump. And I have to say, my response to that was, and the person that raised that was, the trouble with common sense is it isn't common.
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges. I kind of agree that actually, if we have the structures right, it's not always a tension of speed versus diversity. I think the challenge is often there are a lot of facets to diversity and equity of access to things, whether that's based on ethnicity, which we've talked probably most about, but gender, socioeconomic classes, just geography in the UK. That is where a lot, we talk of decentralized trials. There are opportunities there where we need to kind of just make sure that we work as a system, which is really hard. And, how do we use sort of national level research networks? How do we use hub and spoke models? How do we embed more in primary care for clinical trials so that we actually have the systems where we can kind of meet the patients that want access to a trial to enable them to have access to a trial. And that is a tension in that it's very easy. It's relatively easier for us to go back to the same often tertiary centre sites of and working on some of these issues, but that won't necessarily address all of the problems. And for me, that's actually the bigger tension of how do we kind of keep evolving so that we try and address as many of these kind of challenges to access to trials as possible, as well as the kind of speed issue.
Lots of hands. There's one right at the back right first. Oh, no, sorry, you were there first. I do remember.
So Amanda Stewart from Novartis. There's been a few comments during the conversation around maintaining the risk tolerance that we saw during COVID. But as Angela referenced, on the day of the COVID inquiries happening and a media narrative that's kind of changed to like what went wrong during COVID, how do we maintain that risk tolerance? And Suki, I wondered in the work that you've been doing if you've seen any shift because of that shift in the external environment.
Maybe I'll start that one with June, because I'm not sure. I mean, risk tolerance, I'm not sure if you would agree with that framing of it, whether this is just about risk-benefit when the risk is very high. But what do you think the approach there is?
I think the risk scenario was very clear, and that dictated the decisions and the need to move rather quickly. And the way that we allowed trials to overlap, for example, the phases weren't in a religious sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. I think the whole community was flexible, but in a way that we were risk aware. And I think perhaps you're positioning it in a rather, very obvious averse and then, accepting and then averse. I don't think it's quite as simple to tell the story like that, I'm afraid.
Suki, do you want?
Yeah, in terms of the trials we receive, all the approvals are in place, whether they were COVID or not COVID, all the regulation was there, albeit in an accelerated fashion. I think we took some risks around, how we were going to deliver the studies. We had to take some risks in implementing processes quite quickly and how we were going to deliver the trials. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of framing of the question. But although we took some risks in terms of delivery, I don't think now, sort of post-COVID, what we've done is tried to learn from that and apply that learning into kind of all other disease areas. I don't think we're taking more risks necessarily.
This may be a bit of a niche question, but I was interested in the comments that were made earlier about centralisation and also what June was saying about more proportionate decision-making at the regulator. And I just wonder if there's a tension there that some of the push towards centralisation relies on processes that the regulator might actually be trying to get rid of. Do you see that as a tension? If not, we'll move on.
I think your comments about centralisation were more in relation to ethics.
Yeah.
And again, we're working really closely with MHRA to see what we can change in that way. And MHRA want to work as speedily as we will as well for the less risky trials. So I think that's a very good way to move forward.
And I think there's this piece about, I mentioned it at the outset about our incredibly rich data in the UK. The secure data environments, I think, are a big step forward. I hope to improve access to data for research. But this is all about signals and what signals in the trial are coming out. And, being able to get those signals quickly, really quickly. And I also think on the risk, the sooner we can get phase 3 clinical research into real world studies, that really helps with that risk program. I mentioned a very old-fashioned, two very old-fashioned drugs a moment ago, but we look at the, amazing treatments now that are coming in, potentially amazing treatments for obesity, and already we have a question mark about suicidal ideation. And when you actually look at the studies that were carried out, I found a fantastic meta-analysis in the States. Is being morbidly obese a kind of causation for suicidal ideation? And there wasn't one study that could say that it was. So we need to be able to pick up those signals very, very early when these treatments, become available, not in Harley Street, but in Hartlepool, in the UK population.
Martin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a sort of general comment, really, I suppose. Risk, we're talking about risk in different scenarios here, but in general, humans are not very good at assessing risk. The story I quote is of a patient that goes to see a GP and is told they've got a 1 in 3 chance of a smoking-related illness, and they come out of the surgery and they say, well, it's not going to be me. And then they go across to a newsagent's where they buy a lottery ticket where they've got a 1 in 13 billion chance of being successful, and they say, this could be me, this could be me. And so we don't, it's very context specific, and I think trying to understand risk, you do need to understand the context, but you need then to engage whoever it is that you're discussing risk with. So if it's the patient, then I think getting in early and having discussions with patients and demonstrating the value of participating in clinical research. We heard about the idea that it is a good place to be in a clinical research project because you get a lot of attention and you get the best care possible. And I think that concept still needs to be embedded in the patient community because they see themselves as guinea pigs rather than as opportunities to not just advance research but perhaps to benefit their own health.
Right. We've got lots of hands, and I think that hopefully means there'll be opportunities to talk afterwards. I think I'll take 2 last questions. So here with the mic, and then at the back, and then that'll be our lot.
My name is Maria Brzezinski. I'm a head of real-world trials in Imperial College Health Partners, and I work currently on developing London secure data environment. Imperial College Health Partners currently hosts the Discover Now research hub, which Rob Hastings mentioned earlier when he was talking about data linkage. And this research hub supports academic industry and other research partners with real-world evidence generation. And it enables access to primary and secondary care records. And it's currently, with the investment from NHS England and following the success in Northwest London, is being scaled up across London, and which will become a London secure data environment. ICHP, Imperial College Health Partners, developed a service offer which enables companies, which helps through us companies to identify patients' cohorts and offer a referral service to help them to design their clinical trial protocols according to their criteria. And therefore, my question for the panel is, how do you think we can, as an organization, as a secure data environment for London, how can we make ourselves and our office more attractive for commercial industry partners in order to conduct clinical trials in the UK?
Well, first of all, it's an excellent advert. So that's a good start. Does anyone want to pick up? I mean, it's a big question about data, and I mean, does anyone have a particular view on that?
Yeah, happy to. I think, without being rude, I don't think the question's right. In that, I think the offering for commercial organisations is fine as it is, or it's in development, but it's fine. I think the challenge is even. Northwest London, there's a wealth of data sitting in different places, bits getting used sporadically by different people. Actually, it's what is the model for Northwest London where every investigator, every research department can access that data in a way that means something to them so that they can engage the right patients. And that's the bit that's missing, I think, not the engagement with industry. It's actually what for Northwest London is the thing that they need to support what they want to achieve around clinical trials or research using data. So yeah, I think the question is misphrased, and that as you've heard, I'm very positive about the the secure data environments and what we can do working with them.
Angela raised an eyebrow. Did you want to?
I did, because I sort of agree and sort of don't agree.
Okay, we need some controversy.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really excites me about North West London and then Discover Now is playing back to the fact that the UK, from IQVIA's perspective, led the world in real-world trials. And we were placing more real-world trials here a number of years ago than in any other country in Europe. But the Scandics and France caught up really, really quickly. What the secure data environments such as London and the North West London ICS give us the potential to do is to stop the rot that has happened over the last 4 years, where applications to conduct real-world studies take over a year to get approved by NHS Digital, and by that point, France and the Scandics have completed the study. And I feel that, you know, an own goal has been scored in the UK, but I think that London, the Northwest secure data environment, another great secure data environment, have the opportunity to stop that rot. And then I think, from your ask, I think the marketing of Paddington Life Sciences has done a really good job, but I think we can do even better at getting it in the psyche, not just of the industry partners that are in Paddington Life Sciences, but more broadly.
Great. So now I'm working for an ALB. I'm very reluctant to criticise any of them, but NHS Digital does seem to be an issue. Last question at the back, and then I think we'll wrap up.
We've got several cases where there's people that came in to show us, talking about AI, to show us that the technology has been developing even more. And sorry, this is the first time I speak in front of people, so I'm a bit nervous. It developed to the point where from the VR machines, the one that where people play video games with, they've developed potentially treatment for arthritis in the thumb. So looking at how the world is going with technology, do you think that there would be treatment for cancer through technology or not?
So maybe this is, that's a broad question, but do you want to pick up on that a bit?
So depends what you mean with the future, right? So in 5 years' time, we probably are going to be in a similar place. In 50-year times, we are not going to talk about cancer that much. We are going to find a solution. In 500-year times, we are going to be, I don't know, in what other planet, if we don't kill each other first. So either in Mars or back in the caverns. But it depends on what future.
Well, look, I mean, that's a fantastic place to finish a conversation. Where do you go? And I didn't even get to use my digital health joke that I was storing up. No, it's fine. Look, I think we'll wrap up. So Suki, I think, is going to say some words. But before you do, I guess you're going to set up here, are you? Are you on the? Yeah. But, I mean, can I just thank the panel for coming together in different degrees of adversity, and thank you for being candid. I think clearly, in a relatively short space of time, we've covered a very broad, quite thin area, sort of in different areas, and it just highlights how rich this whole area is. And I think we could think a bit more about whether specific aspects we've touched on are worth a particular deep dive again in the future. With a similar group where there are so many big areas like AI, like data science, and so forth, and diversity, where we really need to get into the depths of it. But please do thank on our behalf our audience here and the organisers too, the panel. Thank you.
Echo my thanks to June Raine for that really insightful outlook on MHRA's plans, definitely unleashing the power of clinical trials. Really exciting to hear their reassurance as well, because I know industry has been, concerned but I think they are certainly reassured by your plans. Thanks to Graham for his expert chairing of the panel today, and thank you to our panelists as well. Special thanks to Aysel, Prema and Ellie, who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make today happen, and to have to change the date thanks to tube and train strikes is, really commendable. I really want to say thank you all for coming. For me personally, it's been a really special day because it's, as we've said throughout today, the first inaugural event between Paddington Life Sciences and the White City campus and Imperial College, and will be the first of many events and functions that we have together. So today has been really, really, special for me. And I just want to say that, the life sciences sector has been, one of the jewels in our crown in the UK. And the delivery of the COVID vaccine trials was no exception to that. We have seen some challenges post-pandemic in terms of the recovery. We've all read the ABPI report, which showed that the number of clinical trials in the UK has dropped by 41% over 5 years, which triggered the Lord O'Shaughnessy review on commercial clinical trials. But I think today we've seen how positive the picture is in the UK around clinical trials. And we've heard about, some of the examples of, like the Clinical Trials Alliance that we've spoken about, which was born out of the COVID pandemic. We've heard about the kind of innovation that's going on, and White City is, an exemplar in terms of the innovation that's going on in this country. And the unique selling point in terms of the diversity of our population, I don't think we can underplay that. We have a responsibility to sell UK PLC collectively, and it's up to all of us to deliver on our potential in this country. So thank you everyone for coming, and safe journey home. But there is drinks for those who are not going home. And where is it, Prema? Upstairs. So brilliant. Hope you can join us for a drink. And happy Halloween. Thank you.